Siberia. A camp for Japanese prisoners of war. December 31st, 1950. Among the prisoners in this prisoner of war camp was Itchiku Kubota, a young painter. Despite the severe conditions of captivity, his talent was very much in demand. The master told me personally that a soldier asked him to paint a woman, and he did it by observing her through binoculars. Kubota visited the soldier every evening and sketched the woman. He said he was paid in money and thick potato peelings, which he and the other prisoners cooked and ate. Well, how's it going? Is it ready? In fact, the prisoners and guards shared their imprisonment because they were together all the time. In the absence of females, any picture of a naked woman sketched by Kubota became an excellent present for a camp guard on New Year's Eve. If only he had known how famous the artist would become years later.
We are dealing with a visionary, a genius who revolutionized the ancient art of the traditional kimono. He revised and renewed it. He gave it a new dimension that made it even more artistic. Even in today's Japan, there's no one comparable to him.
This genius was in possession of a mystery. No one, not even his closest friends, knew the secret of his fantastic technique.
I think there was some secret. Of course, it's not for me to judge, but the master himself seemed tormented by it. After all, this craftsmanship might have fallen into someone else's hands.
Itchiku Kubota never revealed his secret. Only once did the master mention by mistake that during one of the most dramatic periods of his life, he had had a vision which became the basis of his unique technique. Pieces of ice are tumbling, a curtain of snow in small patterns. The author of this haiku is the famous Japanese poet Matsuo Basho. He wrote in the 17th century, nearly 400 years before the artist's birth. During his time, a sad event took place. Tsujigahana, the art of coloring relief textiles, was declared illegal, and all knowledge of how to do it disappeared. Centuries later, Itchiku Kubota revived the old master's unique technique. It is as if Basho's haikus gained something eternal on his canvases, his kimonos. In the picturesque town of Fuji Kawaguchiko at the foot of Mount Fujiyama, there's a unique treasure trove nestled in the landscape. When you cross the threshold of this temple of art, you begin to feel at one with nature. The architecture of the museum is a work of art in itself, a harmonious synthesis of many different ideas. Itchiku Kubota built his workshop, now a museum, using only local materials. Examining the details, you can discover an amazing amalgamation of cultures, but the most striking element lies deeper inside. This pyramid is home to a gloriously splendid collection of handmade artworks.
Many visitors have said that after spending many hours in front of the kimonos, they were seized by an entire range of emotions. Some even sobbed. All your senses are exposed and alert. You can sense the fragrance of the garden, the rush of water, the beauty of the kimonos, You can almost touch it.
On a évidemment la beauté des kimonos.
And it becomes an unforgettable experience for both art historians and ordinary museum visitors.
L'art, ou que ce soit pour un visiteur.
For me, seeing the Kubota collection for the first time, what struck me was the light. I had never seen light captured in any form of art in such a way as were captured on these stunning textiles, on these kimonos.
It is no surprise that respected experts call Itchiku Kubota the world's only impressionist on textiles. His daring solutions allowed him to combine what the Japanese viewed as incompatible. What is the secret? How did Kubota achieve his effects?
He was creating it as an entire work of art, even though there were many individual paintings. They were all meant to relate one to the other. And that, to me, is as much of an accomplishment as Monet and his famous Water Lily series.
In my opinion, among all the world's painters I've seen, only Picasso's works have left such a deep impression.
I'd
compare him with the Russian artist Mikhail Vrubel, who possesses that very vibration of small details, like in a mosaic, which makes the entire presentation. Viewed very closely, you can see the tiniest details, and stepping away, the artwork appears to soar. There are features in common with Cézanne's Montagne Sainte-Victoire, which he drew from various perspectives, and with Klimt and Viennese secessionist art. Kubota was certainly an artist who, like most Japanese craftsmen and artists, turned to nature.
But I think it's coming more from a syncretism between his interests and his eye and his emotions and the Impressionists than a copying or imitation. I don't think that's what's going on. I think it's a parallel track.
During his creative years, Kubota produced hundreds of unique pieces of art. Here is The Universe, probably his major work, the apotheosis of his creativity. It's an amazing sight. Scores of splendid kimonos merge into one opulent picture, and as you plunge into the depths of the universe, you suddenly find yourself in the contours and outlines of the unfinished part of his fantastic work. But there is no discord between the splendor and austerity of the contours. 13 black and white sketches explain the rest of the journey Kubota envisaged and take you to the source of his universe. The Big Bang went off in the artist's mind unexpectedly, and at that moment he saw Tsujigahana for the first time.
The word means flowers at the crossroads. It's completely a poetic word, and often the designs include flowers and plants and trees, and the colors tend to be yellows, greens, reds, natural colors, natural dyes. And this was the great inspiration for Kubota at the age of 20 when he saw just a small piece of this kind of fabric in the Tokyo National Museum. And he was completely mesmerized. He was looking at this for 2 hours without moving, and it was fate.
Kubota definitely wanted to revive the ancient art of Tsujigahana, but the secrets of the old masters remained concealed in the past.
During the reign of Tokugawa Tsunayoshi, between 1681 and 1683, a law prohibiting excessive luxury was enacted. I believe that law also banned the use of Tsujigahana, and that would have been one of the reasons for its disappearance. And the fact that Itchiku Kubota presented Tsujigahana to the whole world in the 20th century, and that this art can be admired by people all over the world, is a very significant event indeed.
非常に重要な点がございます。
The artist literally managed to revive the art of the old Japanese masters, an art that had disappeared with time. Ages later, their legacy laid the foundations of Itchiku Kubota's own school. But it did not occur immediately. The way to the summit was long and thorny.
Первый раз, когда я приехал, посетил музей.
When I first visited the museum, I became interested in winter because a series of kimonos featured images of tundra and cold, not typical of Japan, except on Hokkaido in the north. It reminded me of a Russian winter in Siberia. I asked my museum guide, was the artist ever in Russia? And he replied, yes, he was, and for a very long time, as a prisoner of war. Near the end of the Second World War, like many of his comrades, Itchiku Kubota was taken prisoner. More than once, the master visited Yasukuni Temple to admire the blossoms of the sakura, the cherry trees. The trees were in full bloom at the time, and people were singing sijing, verses in the Chinese style. The master kept saying sadly, as he listened to the singing, I survived them all. And I saw he was crying. A veritable blizzard of sakura petals accompanied the verses. That was amazing. I remember him saying to me, I've survived them. We had been captive since August, and we set off for Siberia, never having experienced the winter in Manchuria. As we walked, my feet hurt beyond all bearing. Food was scarce, and maybe that was the most painful thing. Just imagine, the soup looked and tasted more like water. We went to a collective farm for potatoes and loaded a whole lorry with them. The lorries and carts bounced along, spilling the potatoes onto the road. We picked them up, along with manure and stones, and it was only when we warmed it all up later that we knew what it was. From these potatoes, the Japanese prisoners made dumplings called dango, rubbing the tubers against graters they'd made themselves. They punched holes through metal plates and grated potatoes through them. As a prisoner of war, Narita was lucky he returned home alive. Years later, he put his reminiscences on paper and showed us his sketches. Thanks to his memories, we can imagine the conditions under which Itchiku Kubota lived. Here we are, walking to work with saws, bars, levers. It was hard to saw trees. We were deployed in pairs to cut down huge trunks. And in January, we were told that it was not a job for us and sent to help indoors. We were released from that nightmare. Instead of felling trees, we fetched water for the kitchen.
And he said his comrades died in captivity, and he didn't believe he would return home. Of course, we who lived through that time here in Japan, didn't undergo such difficulties. But the master encountered such hardship that my eyes fill with tears every time I think of it.
It was impossible to dig a pit in the frozen ground to bury the dead. So they were put on top of the hill and covered with snow. We had nothing to give the dead, therefore we made dango dumplings of snow. In April, when the snow began to thaw, we were sent to Europe and the dead remained on the hill. Itchiku Kubota remembered that despite all the hardship of his life in captivity, he was not cut off from his favorite activities, and they didn't include only drawing. The prisoners of war had nothing, not even a single piece of wire. When they managed to find some at a construction site, they made wigs and other objects from it and spent their time that way. They toured military units giving theatrical performances. There was just one basic piece of stagecraft missing. The amateur theatre had no actresses, but that was no hindrance because in traditional Japanese kabuki theatre, all the roles are played by men. When male actors in costume and makeup entered the stage, the Russian guards couldn't believe their eyes. They were amazed each time a beautiful Japanese woman appeared on the stage. Normally, war is spoken of as an ordeal, but the master never talked about it that way. Despite the burden of his captivity, Kubota wasn't altogether ungrateful, because during the time he spent in a prison camp, he created something special, which was to play an important role in his own destiny. But only a genuinely free man can be creative. Despite his circumstances, Kubota's spirit remained free, and freedom feeds inspiration. The Kubota phenomenon can only be understood if you put yourself in the place where he was at the time. The ability to look at the world through an artist's eyes, rather than those of a prisoner of war, not only rescued him from the worst, it also let Kubota develop his invaluable creativity. Patterns of ice on the windows would suddenly become gorgeous flowers in the artist's imagination. Gigantic snowflakes found only in the Siberian taiga would later be brought to life on the artist's canvases. Nature generously shared its beauty with him. Kubota found beauty where most of his fellow prisoners could see only difficulty and hardship. He tried to find the richest possible palette of colors in the gray routine of captivity. The Siberian taiga became the artist's creative laboratory. He paid great attention to any shapes and details in relief. While in Siberia, Kubota discovered not only the techniques that formed the basis of his inimitable style, but also the fantastic power of light. It may sound incredible, but it was in Siberia that he became closer to finding the key to the mystery of the old masters. While fetching water, Kubota could dive into his parallel world, where he was the only one who could see things invisible to anyone else. On New Year's Eve in the camp, Kubota again formulated his treasured wish for freedom, which would eventually come true. The 7 gods of fortune would come racing towards him out of the depths of the universe. A magic ship from Japanese legends would break through the bleak Siberian days to take the captive away to another mysterious and happy world. Its sails were filled with the long-awaited wind of freedom.
And when he'd reached the point when he thought he'd never go back to Japan, he saw a sunset. The master said that he'd offered to paint that sunset if he ever returned. And he kept his promise. I saw that painting at an exhibition. He featured just one magnificent sunset, its light.
I very much like sun, setting sun. I think it really encapsulates much of what motivated him in terms of the time he spent in Siberia looking at the sun and the setting sun every night and taking comfort from that and studying the way the light changed color, which became very, very important in his work.
The collection, the Symphony of Light, began with this work, the sun. As the master pictured to himself, it marked the starting point. When he was called out to the front, he thought he would never be able to begin dyeing fabric. But having seen a Siberian sun, he painted this picture. For the master, his life in a camp in Siberia and his return to his homeland became a starting point, an impetus to begin seriously dyeing fabric.
After World War II, as soon as he returned from Siberia, he had his vision. He focused on his art. He experimented with various means at his disposal, all in order to expand the technique, which deeply influenced him and was the source of his enthusiasm. Thank God the master's wife waited and took care of the children all that time. When the master returned home, he began dyeing fabric, earning very little. And, as he said, he suffered a lot because he had to pay for the children's breakfast at school, but there was no money. His captivity had been an ordeal, but when he came back to Japan, he had to lead a very modest life. And it was only thanks to all his efforts to contribute to Tsujigahana art that he was able to earn fame. That's what gives value to Kubota's work. In fact, it's an absolutely unique phenomenon in modern art. It's unique in traditional art. It's a unique vision of things. It's something that isn't done at all in the field of the kimono and very rarely in the field of art.
The Japanese treat the kimono with great care. The traditional Japanese garment has already existed for 1,000 years and contains various meanings. The history as well as the culture of Japan are integrated within this concept. In Japanese, kimono literally means a thing to wear. Actually, the kimono is something surprising. For example, we all begin to think about what we'll do every day. And there is an expression, to assume a serious air, literally, to set one's collar right. If Japanese people wear a kimono, it means they agree to master and adopt the rules of common courtesy, good manners, and the like. Folds and wrinkles in European clothing are considered untidy. In the kimono, folds are of great significance, and they're preserved in the way it's worn. They reflect a code of behavior central to Japanese culture. The notion of education is depicted in the kimono, more precisely in the way it's sewn. there is a parallel between the straight lines in which the pieces are stitched and the way life should be led. So kimonos provide a guideline in life. Kubota followed that guideline all his life. He did not just create the kimono in a customary sense like a craftsman. He was an artist, and each kimono he created was a picture, a true work of art. I was surprised when I first saw Kubota's works. Were they actually kimonos? I thought they were kimono-shaped canvases. It was as if I weren't staring at a kimono, but at an oversized painted canvas, a screen, or even a curtain. That similarity struck me. To create his canvases, Kubota applied a special technique known only to him. By pressing pieces of cloth together, he was compressing space in a way, so it would explode when it was dipped into paint. This was no chaotic chain reaction. The artist was able to remember not only the most sophisticated patterns, but also the particular color of each of 100 sewn elements to be painted. He puzzled over and verified the synthesis of graphic arts and high geometry meticulously.
He said himself that he felt great tenderness towards his brushes. Each brushstroke is important. At the same time, you forget those brushstrokes when you see his work. I'm also thinking about the spaces left unpainted on the cloth, to give him the opportunity to apply another ancient technique to them. And that's China ink. He used black ink to contrast with more delicate colors. And he managed to establish a rhythm in the design by means of black strokes, to emphasize it, as is done in calligraphy, but always with great finesse. And it's absolutely sublime when you see the result. You don't know where the first or the second stroke began and where it ends.
C'est-à-dire que vous pouvez passer 1 heure à regarder un kimono.
You can stand for a whole hour in front of a kimono and you'll never see two identical details. And that's what makes it extremely interesting, that search for details. And when you realize it could take Kubota a whole year to produce one kimono, you begin to understand better how he used his time making that kimono.
He also was very open to inventing new techniques, to inventing new ways to do things, new ways to present kimono. He was very concerned that the kimono was going to become obsolete if people didn't integrate them somehow into their everyday life in some way. So this led to him doing a fashion show with kimono worn more like Western-style coats, with belts that were not obi, with high heels, on Western models. He was looking for ways to bring the kimono, keep it very traditional, and yet bring it into the 20th century.
Historically, we have always seen some extraordinary output and pioneering, whether it be in fashion or art, from Japan. And this marriage between art and fashion coming from Japan, this is not the first time we have seen this. What I think is extraordinary about Kubota's work, that he almost has paved the way for such artistic collaborations as we see today with Takashi Murakami and Louis Vuitton.
He had a theatrical sense in what he produced, in the way he presented it. And I think this appealed to, for example, actresses. I mean, there's a sense of drama, around an actress. And I think that resonated with them because there was something dramatic about his work, and it was outstanding.
We met about 30 years ago. The best-known actresses wore kimonos in Japan in those days. I first met Itchiku Kubota when I'd been invited to see the artist, a wonderful man and an expert at work on cloth. He was very rigorous when it came to cloth and its dyeing. He was a devil himself. A program called The Demon's Art was even created on TV. But in ordinary life, he was a kind and loving person, yet rigorous.
Admirers of Kubota's talent include television celebrities, businesswomen, and fashion designers. Here in these photos, he is pictured beside Sonia Rikel.
Very few were analytical about what he was doing. Very few tried to put his work into any kind of context. And I thought he was a really interesting example of what I would characterize as tradition and innovation. If you wore one of his kimono that he would, of course, specially make for you, you stood out. You were very special in the room.
私あんまりその出品の
The textile seemed so beautiful to me that I turned to him and asked, "Excuse me, could you make a kimono for us?"
どうしたらよろしゅうございますかって伺いました。そうしましたら
And the master replied he'd make one that would fit me and invited me to his home.
から私の家へいらしてくださいっておっしゃったんですね。それがそもそもの
That was the beginning of our close acquaintance.
それから2人でお友達と2人で
I came with a friend to visit him. He lived quite far away from Tokyo.
東京から遠いと思いましたけれど
I was really very glad the meeting took place.
お出会いでございました。
Here is the kimono Kubota made especially for Mrs. Takioka. One day, an interview she gave in a Japanese newspaper would transform the life of a young Japanese man. The article mentioned a kimono with cranes made by Mrs. Takioka while she was being trained by Kubota. The young man asked her to introduce him to the master.
その頃はそういうふうにあった。
I had just left my job at a hotel and was looking for a new one when I saw the newspaper article mentioning the master Itchiku Kubota. I decided I want to be trained by him at all costs.
僕も絶対に教わりたいと思ったんですね。8時半から
The workshop started at 8:30, but I arrived there at 8:10 and busied myself by tidying up for 20 minutes.
20分間はそういう
And it continued like that for 8 years.
ずっとしましたね。
As for the work itself, at first we were not given brushes.
はこう筆の
For 3 years, we did the so-called washing.
間ぐらいは
Our job was to rinse the material.
ずっと水元でした。
But the whole procedure was new to me, so the 3 years flew by in a jiffy.
3年間なんてあっちゅう間に過ぎて、それを一子一伝みたいにですね、伝承してい
The
く
master did not order us to observe and learn.
見て覚えるんだったら覚え
It looked more like this. If you are able to memorize, do it.
先生が本当に描きたかったその
I think that is the secret.
したその辻が
And I think none but the master would have been able to create this Tsujigahana technique based, as he wished, on the past and only adding a little part of himself.
先生はこう一種類の辻
The
が
master created the technology by making use of more than just patterns on cloth.
を加味してその
He also integrated different methods, including oil painting.
全て入ってるんですね。その技術っていうのは。
Il a aussi introduit par exemple des films.
He also embedded, for instance, metallic threads into textiles intentionally for the technique he wanted to use. And that modified its relief in terms of color and light.
Par rapport à la couleur, par rapport à la lumière. C'est vraiment un travail pictural.
It's really a pictorial work.
D'un coup, on ne sait plus si
And thanks to this, suddenly you're no longer sure whether he used only Yudzen technique,
avec
in which areas are covered with rice gruel,
une pâte de riz,
so as to leave out color-free patches,
un endroit
which are then colored by hand afterwards.
que l'on peint ensuite à la main.
The master decided to reconstruct this technology in the present day, after it had virtually disappeared. It's striking that his passion didn't fade with time. Not only did he revive the technique that had previously existed, he also added a small share of his personal beliefs. And that's why this technology can be called Itchiku Kubota Tsujigahana.
Many of the textile specialists in Japan were offended by this. They felt that he was not respecting the great tradition of Tsujigahana. And even though he was calling this Itchiku, after his first name, Tsujigahana, they felt that he had no right to use the term because he wasn't making the true Tsujigahana. But he was an artist. He wasn't interested in just copying something from 4 centuries ago.
Kubota added the name of the ancient art to his own technique because of his profound respect for the memory of the old Japanese masters.
So perhaps in another life, he himself was a textile artist making Tsujigahana. However, he tried for many, many years to recreate this, and he found that he couldn't get the right kind of silk. His use of natural dyes was complicated, and he decided that he would instead develop his own techniques inspired by Tsujigahana, but not reproducing it. He became much more artistic-minded and not so interested in the historic process, but in developing something that came from his original inspiration.
He was alert to every minute opportunity to see natural phenomena in the most wonderful colors and remained so throughout the rest of his life. Kubota behaved like a hunter in his search for inspiration. The master traveled a lot. One day, he stopped in Hakone when a storm broke out. At the very place we emerged from the tunnel, Mount Fuji appeared in ultramarine blue before our eyes. The master said then that it was as if the mountain had been painted. He said Fuji was a sacred mountain, and each time it revealed new aspects to him. When we were halfway to our destination and strolling among the buildings, I saw a perfectly red Fuji on the opposite side of the road. Washed by the rain the night before, the mountain stood without its snow cap in the rays of the summer morning sun. But we never managed to see a red Fuji any other time. The artist was possessed by his ambition to convey the beauty of nature, to show it in a way no one else had ever done before. He kept looking for new sources of inspiration. He remained true to himself in his search for beauty, even if it was dangerous. It was as if the master were challenging things he had not experienced before. At the age of 71, he obtained a scuba diving license. Not everybody is granted a diving permit without knowing how to swim, but he did when he was 71. The master said afterwards that when he jumped down off the bow of the fishing boat, he felt scared to death. Not everyone has the gift of sensing the beauty of the world around us, and only a small number of the select few can transmit what they've seen in a way we call genius. Undoubtedly, Kubota is one of that select few.
He was kind of a revolutionary. He created his own path. His exhibitions of his work were often outside of Japan because the Japanese themselves did not understand or appreciate exactly what he was doing.
He had many exhibitions outside of Japan. They received great praise. The exhibitions we did in San Diego, and then it went to Canton, Ohio, the same exhibition.
Itchiku Kubota celebrated the turn of the 21st century working at his major creation, consisting of nearly 100 splendid kimonos. 13 canvases remained unfinished, and they will remain sketches. The artist died in 2003. In a few years, the museum he had established faced serious financial problems. The custodians hoped to rescue the collection up to the bitter end, but unfortunately, no one seemed anxious to help, and preparations began to sell Kubota's masterpieces at auction piecemeal.
Я думаю, что это был бы большой урон.
I think it would have been a great loss. A thing like that must not be done. It shouldn't be done. Though we know from history that artworks travel and live their own lives. Like our children, they have a destiny of their own. Each work took oceans of time and required enormous passion, of course. The master said he wasn't willing to sell his works because then nothing would be left. I believe he was offered a pretty high price for them, though. Of course, that would have been a great loss.
But the 7 gods of fortune that had haunted the artist in his dreams on dark Siberian nights did not desert him at that difficult moment. The collection was rescued from oblivion. I love this country. I need it, and coming here nourishes me. The Japanese are a very complex people. They have to be understood. This is a unique culture, unlike any other in Asia. The Chinese come close to it. Koreans are close, let's say, in many areas. But the Japanese are a completely distinct nation. Patok Chodiev's love of Japan began during his youth at the Moscow Institute of International Relations. After graduating from the institute, the future patron of the arts worked in Tokyo and discovered for himself the unique culture of the land of the rising sun.
Блаженство. Так назвала свою работу Хори Рюдзио, изобразив танцующую женщину в костюме XVII века. Кукла-марионетка Народного театра Авадзи, который не так давно был в Москве. Известные художники украшают ткани и национальные женские костюмы кимоно.
Japanese art is extremely special. It is only possible to love what you understand. I was utterly charmed by Kubota's works, and then I left a message saying I was prepared to purchase the collection. It is the property of Japan. I just want to leave something to the Japanese, especially to the young people who will enjoy this art in the future. I'm sure it's the way Mr. Shodiev said. He learned a lot in Japan, and all he's doing now is out of gratitude, and I'm very glad about it. And I feel grateful with all my heart to Mr. Shodiev and to all those Russian people who are full of determination to do their best to save this culture and art in Japan. It is a very meaningful step. Ideally, it would have been good if the government could have bought this collection, but that's difficult financially. That's why Mr. Shodiev bought the entire collection. And it is not an empty gesture. He loves Japan. He sees the culture of Japan almost as being his own. One thing I want, of course, is to bring the collection to Russia. I want to show it and let people see. Moreover, in Russia, there is intense interest in Japan and its culture. I work a lot in Kazakhstan, and I want to take it there. There is interest in the collection in America as well as in London. And if the collection is sent abroad, it will of course promote Japan and its culture. It is great that Japanese kimonos will be viewed worldwide, and I am very grateful to him for that. Not only as Mr. Shodiev's friend, but also as a Japanese individual and politician. I thank him with all my heart. It's very good indeed.
What Kubota has been able to achieve in building and creating and building this collection of extraordinary kimonos is effectively build an aesthetic bridge between the European world and Japan. Whether you are in Japan looking at these stunning works of art, or you are looking through a European aesthetic eyes at these works of art,
Organizing major exhibitions is a troublesome and very expensive business. Fortunately, the collection has experienced friends capable of maintaining its high standard.
So 1858 Limited is an international advisory business. It's privileged to work with some of the world's most significant collections worldwide. And when the owners of the Itchiku Kubota collection had recently acquired the works and kimono came to us, asking us to properly look and value and look after this collection. They knew at the time that they had acquired something of extra special and extraordinary nature,
As an art historian specializing in Asia and Asian textiles, I can say Kubota's art comes across as quite a specific art, and I'd like to note, a fully fledged one. I'm pointing this out because in the history of Asian textiles, at least the way it's considered in France, textile art is regarded as a craft rather than a fully fledged art. It's regarded as a skill. Kubota's work fits into the history of painting rather than into the history of textiles.
Aurélie Samuel is one of the key experts on Japanese textiles in Europe. She works at the National Museum of Asian Art in Paris. Also known as the Musée Guimet, it has one of the best collections in the world. While filming, we managed to peep into the vault, where they keep unique works along with textiles by Asian masters from different periods. And the kimono collection is mind-boggling.
Dans le jiban que l'on voit derrière moi, c'est-à-dire
Behind me, there's a juban. It's an underkimono, and it seems to have been made for a wedding.
L'utilisation du tissu de base, c'était déjà
Considering the red background color and the pattern damask used as a basic material, the weave itself contains flower motifs, cloud motifs, and swastikas.
Ensuite, avec la technique du shibori.
Then, using the shibori technique, coloring it by tie-dyeing, the same motifs were repeated.
Des mêmes motifs.
The term shibori comes from the verb shiboru, meaning to twist up while pressing. This gives relief to the cloth while producing small circles of color, called kanoko shibori.
Et ce qui m'a semblé très intéressant, par exemple, en repos.
What was interesting to me, for example, in the revival of Tsujigahana technique, is to consider the fibre.
Cette fibre, c'est la soie.
The fibre is silk. Masters still work on silk. But since it was impossible to find silk identical to that of the 15th or 16th century, Itchiku Kubota used tirimen to revive the tradition.
Tirimen, c'est-à-dire
This crepe silk is different from the silk used in the 15th century.
au 15e.
ご自分の作品に対しては非常な誇りと
He always took pride in his own works.
けれどもでもそんなに
He might have regarded them as his own mission, but he never boasted about his mastery.
物柔らかな
Actually, he was a very considerate and tender person.
なさる本当に日本人
For a Japanese, he had a remarkable personality. I always felt that, but I never told him.
ましたちっとも祝ってらっしゃいませんでしたで私はあの方から人間として
I received a great deal of human warmth from the master, and I'm grateful to him for that.
取ったと言いますかありがたかったと言いますか
It's perhaps what's remained most in my
大
mind.
きく占めてるよね
芸術家久保田一竹っていうよりか人間久保田
The master was not just the artist Itchiku Kubota. He was a man, higher than the sun, deeper than the sea. That's how great the master was. I'm speaking figuratively, but it's complicated to express.
ものを深く理
I
解
think the master had a special hidden talent for understanding the essence of things.
だと思うんですね。
100でいいです。しわくちゃんになって人の世話になってまで生きていたくはないと思ってます。100まで例えば連作も連作それは80枚の連作はあと100年かかります。でもどうにかなるでしょう。弟子がついてくれるでしょう。そんなことで私は100まで迎えに来たら蹴っ飛ばしてやろうと思って頑張りたいと思ってます。
The artist seemed certain that his legacy would not only be saved, but that it would continue to grow. It would be more than a shame if this unique art were to fade away over time, sharing the fate of the historical Tsujigahana. Who knows how many centuries will pass before another beauty-obsessed artist comes along who might be capable of repeating Itchiku Kubota's creative feat. And wasn't that the master's true intention? Anyone in the future who can fathom his secret and finish his 13 unfinished works is destined to carry on his legacy, to build a bridge linking past, present, and future in the amazing universe of a remarkable artist, Itchiku Kubota.